My name is Edgar Moran. I turned 81 last December, though I doubt anyone in my family remembered. I live alone now in a creaking two-story house at the edge of a small town in southern Pennsylvania, a place that still holds on to its traditions, like an old man gripping the handle of his cane. The house is older than I am, Victorian, wood-framed, weather-worn, with a porch that overlooks a street too quiet for the present century. It used to be a beautiful home. My wife, Clara, painted the kitchen walls pale yellow and kept flower pots on every windowsill. She said sunlight made a home feel alive. After she passed away 6 years ago, the plants died one by one. I never replaced them. The kitchen is still yellow, but it's a duller yellow now, like it forgot how to smile. Clara's death hollowed me out. It wasn't dramatic. A heart attack one ordinary Tuesday morning while I was bringing in the paper. But it cracked my world in half. She was already up, making tea, humming something I couldn't place. I still remember the silence that followed the sound of the kettle whistling, the cup shattering on the floor, the quiet thud of her body collapsing onto the tiles. I don't talk about it, because if I do, I'll have to remember how long it took the ambulance to come, how cold her skin was when I touched her cheek, how strange it felt that the world outside the window kept turning while mine had stopped. After Clara's funeral, my daughter Joanna stayed for 3 nights. She brought her own coffee creamer, rearranged the spice rack, and asked if I'd thought about next steps. My son Victor came for the service, but left before the reception. Said he had meetings. I haven't seen either of them since. For the first few years after Clara passed, I tried to maintain routines. I woke up at 6:30 a.m. every morning, made oatmeal the way she liked it, stovetop, not microwave, and read the local newspaper from front to back, even the classifieds. I walked every day, even when my knees hurt. I donated to the library, went to town council meetings, tried to remind myself that life was still mine to live. But routines are poor substitutes for love, and eventually, they became just another way to measure the silence. I started forgetting appointments. I'd find cold cups of tea in strange places, the bathroom counter, the garage workbench. The worst part wasn't the forgetfulness. It was realizing how little it mattered if I forgot. There was no one watching, no one to disappoint. Joanna calls once a month, maybe. Her voice is always rushed, professional, like she's delivering a quarterly report. She works in healthcare administration now, married a man named Alan, who I met exactly once. They live in a suburb north of Philadelphia, in a house with a security gate and a hot tub. She always asks if I'm managing okay, and when I say yes, she pauses for a beat before moving on. Victor doesn't call. He sends texts sometimes, usually links to articles he thinks I should read. Investment strategies, Medicare scams, TED Talks about aging with grace. He lives in Denver. I don't know exactly what he does now, something with fintech, whatever that means. We used to be close, Victor and I. He wanted to be a history teacher, like me. Then he changed majors junior year and started speaking in buzzwords. There are days I almost convince myself I'm content. I watch birds from the porch, feed the neighborhood strays, reread old books until the pages fall out. But then I'll see an older couple holding hands in the grocery store, or a child laughing in the park, and something inside me aches so sharply it feels like a wound. I have no grandchildren. Joanna and Alan decided early on they weren't kid people. Victor dated a woman named Erica, who had 2 children from a previous marriage. But they broke up years ago. I sometimes wonder what kind of grandfather I would have been. I think I would have read them bedtime stories and built elaborate model train sets. Clara would have made them cocoa and knitted mittens in impossible colors. My body is starting to turn on me. My hands shake when I write, and there are days my legs refuse to carry me past the mailbox. I've fallen twice in the past year, once in the shower, once outside on the porch steps. I lay there staring at the sky, too stunned to call for help. After that, Joanna suggested I consider assisted living. She sent brochures in the mail. One of them had a smiling elderly couple gardening in raised flower beds. "It's not a home," the slogan read. "It's a new beginning." I threw it in the trash. What people don't understand is that home isn't just where you sleep. It's where you remember who you were when someone still loved you. Sometimes I sit at Clara's old piano and press the keys, though I've forgotten how to play. She was the musician. She used to say music made her feel less alone, even in a room full of people. I didn't understand that then. I do now. The house feels heavier these days, as if it's sagging under the weight of my memories. I know the walls are just drywall and plaster, but they feel sentient, like they remember Clara's laughter and my children's footsteps better than I do. At night, I hear the creak of the floorboards and imagine it's her. I talk to her sometimes. I tell her about the birds, about how the town council wants to install parking meters downtown, about the dog that comes by every morning looking for scraps. I tell her I miss her, that I'm trying, that it's hard. Last winter, I caught pneumonia and spent 5 days in the hospital. I don't remember much of it, just the oxygen mask, the beeping machines, the 2 bright lights. Joanna visited once, stayed for 20 minutes, and asked if I had updated my will. Victor didn't come. A nurse named Carlene held my hand the second night when I couldn't stop coughing. She was kind. She reminded me of Clara in the way she tucked the blanket around my shoulders. When I was discharged, they gave me a pamphlet on managing chronic conditions after 80. I read it once and tucked it away in the drawer with the brochures from Joanna. I don't want to die. Not because I fear death. I've made peace with the idea that life has a natural end. But because I don't want my story to end like this. A lonely old man, dismissed and filed away by his own children, living in a house that feels more like a museum than a home. I want to believe there's still time to do something meaningful, even if it's small. I want to be remembered for more than just my decline, but more than that, I want to see the truth of what my children have become. Not the polite smiles they offer during short visits, but the cold calculations behind their eyes when they think I'm not looking. I know something isn't right. I can feel it in the way Joanna avoids my gaze when she talks about my future, and how Victor's texts have started to include phrases like asset protection and durable power of attorney. They think I'm slipping. They think I don't notice, but I do. I wasn't always an old man. I once stood in front of a classroom full of teenagers and made them care about ancient Rome and the Civil War. I once loved a woman so completely that we created a world together out of shared glances and quiet routines. I was once the man people came to for advice, for guidance. I haven't forgotten who I am. Not yet. And if my children are planning what I think they are, they'll find out soon enough that their father may be old, but he is not finished. Not by a long shot. It began with a fall, sudden and humiliating, though the injury itself was minor, a bruised hip, a scrape along my forearm, nothing serious. What made it unforgettable was the context. It happened in my own kitchen, on a perfectly ordinary morning in March while reaching for a jar of strawberry jam from the upper shelf. My legs buckled, just gave out from under me, and the next thing I knew I was on the floor, the jar smashed beside me, sticky sweetness seeping into the linoleum like a slow, stubborn accusation. I don't remember losing consciousness, but I must have. When I opened my eyes, the light had shifted across the room, and a shaft of sun from the window was glaring directly into my face. I lay there for what must have been 20 minutes, unsure whether I had broken anything, humiliated more than frightened, until I was able to slowly pull myself up using the counter for support. My breath was shaky, and I could feel the beginnings of a terrible ache forming in my side, But more than anything, I felt exposed. Like I had crossed some invisible threshold where a fall was no longer an accident, but a symptom of something greater. Something irreversible. I didn't call anyone. I cleaned the floor as best I could, changed my clothes, and sat in my armchair by the window trying to read but unable to concentrate. That afternoon, I decided to drive myself to the clinic, though I hadn't driven in weeks. The roads were clear, the traffic light, and I told myself I was just being cautious. The nurse at the front desk raised her eyebrows when I told her my age, and I felt her gaze linger on the bruising across my cheekbone as I explained that I had taken a tumble but was just fine. They ran a few tests, took my blood pressure, checked for signs of concussion, and finally sent me for a CT scan. Just precautionary, the technician said, smiling with practiced reassurance. I waited in the little exam room for over an hour, staring at the faded poster on the wall that showed a cartoon heart wearing running shoes. When the doctor came in, he didn't sit down. He stood by the door, holding a folder, frowning slightly. "Mr. Moran," he said, "you're lucky nothing's broken, but the scan shows some signs of cortical atrophy, brain shrinkage. It's not uncommon at your age, but I'd like to refer you to a neurologist just to be safe." I asked him what it meant, and he launched into a speech about how the brain naturally loses volume over time, about how some patients never notice any symptoms, while others begin to experience mild cognitive issues, forgetfulness, confusion, disorientation. I nodded along, but I couldn't help but feel he was already writing a new version of me, one where I was no longer a man who had taught history for 4 decades, but someone whose greatest challenge would be remembering where he put his slippers. He must have noted my silence because he softened his tone. "It's early, these things develop slowly, but it's good to be proactive." I left with a referral and a printout on understanding mild cognitive impairment, a phrase I hated instantly. At home, I tucked the printout into the junk drawer beneath a pile of expired coupons and old batteries. I wasn't in denial. I simply didn't believe that one scan was enough to rewrite the narrative of my life. 3 days later, Joanna arrived unannounced. She stood on the porch with a reusable grocery bag in one hand and a forced smile. "Thought I'd check in," she said. She hadn't visited in nearly 6 months. I didn't ask how she knew about the fall. I assumed the clinic had called her as my emergency contact. She made tea, bustling around the kitchen as if she had grown up in that space, though she'd left for college at 17 and had never really come back. Her voice was light, her tone cheerful, but there was an undercurrent of calculation to everything she said. "I brought you some groceries, low-sodium stuff, organic soups, almond milk. It's all heart-healthy." I told her I didn't like almond milk. She smiled, like that didn't matter. She waited until we sat down in the living room before bringing out the manila folder. "Just a few things I want you to look over," she said. "No pressure." Inside were documents, a power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, a revocable living trust. The words blurred together in my head, but I recognized enough to feel alarmed. "What is all this?" I asked. She launched into a rehearsed explanation about how she and Victor were just trying to help, how it was important to have plans in place just in case, how it would make things easier down the line. When I didn't respond, she leaned forward, her smile now tight and brittle. "Dad, the fall, it scared us. And the doctor said—" I cut her off. "The doctor said it's common for someone my age. He didn't say I was losing my mind." Her expression didn't change. "Still, you need to start thinking about the future. We want to make sure you're protected." Protected. The word sat like a stone in my chest. It sounded suspiciously like controlled. She tapped the top page with a neatly manicured nail. If you sign this, we can help manage your accounts, make sure your bills are paid, talk to your doctors. It's really just a formality. I asked where Victor was in all this, and she said he was in Denver but had reviewed everything already. He agrees it's the right step. I didn't sign. I told her I needed time to think. She didn't press, but when she left later that evening, the manila folder was still on the table, slightly askew, as if waiting to be reopened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Clara's old chair staring at the folder, wondering when exactly my children had stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a liability. There had been moments, of course, little signs I had ignored. Victor asking about my pension. Joanna casually bringing up assisted living options, but I had told myself they were just concerned, that they loved me, that they were trying, in their own distant way, to stay connected. Now I wasn't so sure. A week later, I received a letter in the mail from a lawyer I had never heard of. It was formal, impersonal, and chilling. It informed me that due to recent medical concerns, and in the best interests of the client, a petition had been filed to initiate proceedings for limited guardianship, with Joanna listed as the proposed guardian. I read it twice before I could process it. My hands shook, not from age this time, but from rage. They weren't waiting. They weren't giving me time. They were moving forward assuming I wouldn't notice, wouldn't resist, wouldn't fight. They were carving up my life like scavengers, circling a carcass they believed was already dead. That evening, I called Victor. He didn't pick up. I left a message. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "I know what you're doing, and I'm not gone yet." I didn't expect a response. There was none. I sat in the dark for a long time after that call, the letter on my lap, the room silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. And in that silence, something hardened in me. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. If they wanted to act as though I were already fading, then I would remind them exactly who I was. They thought they could decide what came next. They were wrong. This was still my story, and I wasn't ready to be written out of it. A few days after receiving the guardianship letter, something shifted in me. Not a dramatic change, not a sudden burst of courage or rage, but a quiet, deliberate clarity, the kind that seeps into a man like morning fog and refuses to lift. I stopped waiting for phone calls, stopped giving my children the benefit of the doubt. I started writing everything down, dates, names, details. I gathered every financial statement, every medical record, and made copies. I contacted my old colleague, Thomas Wren, a retired attorney who once taught a semester at the community college with me. He now lived alone in a small apartment above a bookstore on Main Street. When I told him what was happening, he didn't express shock. Instead, he poured me a glass of water and nodded, his eyes grave but unsurprised. "It's more common than you think," he said. "Families positioning themselves early. It starts with concern, ends with power of attorney." We sat together for 2 hours that afternoon. I gave him the documents, the letter from Joanna's lawyer, the printouts from the clinic. Thomas read them all carefully, making notes in a small black notebook. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "They're moving quickly. You need to act." I asked him if it was legal, what they were trying to do, and he said yes, technically. But that doesn't make it right. The law can be bent by people who know how to manipulate perception. They're painting you as confused, declining, incapable. That's enough to get the court's attention, especially if they have a doctor's word to support it. I told him about the clinic, the scan, the doctor who had spoken so vaguely, and he nodded again. You need your own evaluation, someone impartial, someone reputable. And you need to document everything from this point forward. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a neurologist in the next town over, an older man named Dr. Clayton, who had no connection to my family or local healthcare network. It took 3 hours of testing, cognitive evaluations, memory assessments, reflexes, balance checks. At the end, Dr. Clayton looked at me with a steady, unflinching gaze and said, "Mr. Moran, your results are within the normal range for someone your age. You exhibit no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or impairment. You're sharp. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He wrote a full report, signed and notarized. I left the clinic feeling lighter than I had in months. That afternoon, I returned home to find a voicemail from Joanna. Her voice was clipped, professional, as always. "Dad, I hope you're doing okay. Victor and I would like to meet soon to discuss the next steps. There's no pressure, but it would be better for everyone if we could agree on a plan together." I deleted the message without replying. A plan. That's what they called it now. I began locking my mailbox. I changed the code on my garage. I kept the manila folder of legal papers on the kitchen counter, but now it sat beside a fresh binder with tabs and dividers. I wasn't confused. I wasn't passive. I was watching. 2 days later, I went to my local bank to inquire about the joint account I had opened with Joanna when she was in college, a forgotten relic of another time, one I had continued to funnel small amounts into monthly, almost by habit. The manager, a polite woman named Marla, printed the transaction history for me. My hands trembled as I read it, not from illness, but from the mounting realization that my daughter had been siphoning off funds without ever speaking a word to me. Withdrawals every month, sometimes twice. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. I asked Marla to freeze the account, then close it. I signed the necessary forms, handed her my ID, and said nothing else. I returned home and sat in Clara's chair with the binder on my lap, going over the statements. My daughter, whom I had taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I had kissed better, had been stealing from me, quietly, incrementally, like a slow drip of poison. And Victor? I had no proof yet, but I knew. I could feel it in his silence, in the way he never answered my messages unless it was to send another article about financial preparedness or aging with dignity. That evening, I called Thomas again. "They've already begun," I told him. "They're taking pieces of me while I'm still breathing." He told me to come in the next day. We drafted a counter-statement, a notarized declaration of competency. We attached Dr. Clayton's evaluation and began preparing a petition to contest the guardianship. But Thomas warned me that even with all this, the court might still side with Joanna and Victor if they presented enough evidence of supposed incapacity. "What kind of evidence?" I asked. He shrugged. "A recorded phone call where you sound confused, a letter where you mix up dates, witnesses who say you've been wandering or repeating yourself. It doesn't take much when people are determined." The next blow came the following week. I received another letter, this time from the county court. A hearing date had been set, 3 weeks from now. They were not waiting for me to agree. They were moving forward without my consent. Joanna's name was listed as the petitioner. Victor was a co-signatory. The letter was sterile, legal, devoid of emotion, but I could feel the betrayal dripping from every line. They had planned this, discussed it behind my back, prepared for months while I was still mourning, still hoping they might return to me as children, not opportunists. I called Joanna the next day. She answered on the second ring, her voice carefully cheerful. "Hi, Dad. Everything okay?" I didn't return the pleasantry. "I got the court letter." A pause, then, "Oh, yes. I was going to call you about that." I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the calculated softness. It's not meant to be hostile. We're just trying to protect you. We're worried, that's all. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Another pause. "Because we knew you'd resist. You always think you're fine, even when you're not." I wanted to ask her how she would know when she hadn't spent more than an hour in my home in 2 years. But I didn't. Instead, I asked her why she had been withdrawing money from the joint account. Silence. Then, "That money was for the family. You always said—" "I said no such thing," I cut her off. "You took it. That's theft." Her voice hardened. "If you're going to start throwing accusations, maybe this is exactly why you need someone to make decisions for you." I hung up. After that, the air in the house changed. I no longer felt like I was living alone. I felt watched, encroached upon, as if my autonomy had been placed under glass and labeled contested property. I stopped answering the door. I ignored unknown numbers. I wrote letters to myself every night documenting my state of mind, the events of the day, small memories. I knew they might one day be used in court, and I wanted my voice on record, unfiltered, unedited, true. And then came the phone call that tipped the balance. It was from a woman named Susan, a social worker from Adult Protective Services. She said she had been contacted by a concerned family member, Joanna, of course, who claimed I was living in unsafe conditions. She said, "You've been falling, forgetting things, letting bills go unpaid." I asked her if she'd been to my house. She admitted she hadn't, but said she was obligated to investigate. I agreed to let her come by. When she arrived 2 days later, I met her at the door with the binder in hand. I showed her the neurologist's report, the bank statements, the letters from the lawyer. I gave her tea, answered every question clearly, walked her through my home, pointed out my working stove, the grab bars in the bathroom, the weekly pill organizer on the kitchen counter. She stayed for over an hour. When she left, she said softly, "Mr. Moran, I'm very sorry. You don't need supervision. You need to be left in peace." I watched her drive away, and for the first time in weeks, felt the smallest flicker of hope. But that hope was fleeting, because as the court date approached, I knew one thing with painful certainty. My children were not finished, not even close. They had decided that I was dying, whether physically or mentally, and they had set their plans in motion accordingly. They believed I wouldn't fight, that I'd go quietly, that my objections would be lost in the noise of old age. They had underestimated me. And that was going to be their first real mistake. The hearing day arrived with a dull weight pressing on my chest, a heavy fog of uncertainty that settled early in the morning and refused to lift. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue sweater that Clara had knitted for me years ago, and a pair of trousers that still fit comfortably, though I knew I looked older than I felt. The house was silent, almost reverent, as if it too sensed the significance of the moment. The drive to the courthouse was longer than I remembered, the roads winding through sleepy neighborhoods where faces were unfamiliar and stories untold. Joanna and Victor were waiting outside the building, their expressions unreadable, guarded, like strangers masquerading as family. Joanna gave me a quick, rehearsed smile, while Victor's eyes flicked away as if reluctant to meet mine. Inside the courtroom, the air was sterile and cold, the hum of whispered conversations and shuffling papers filling the spaces between formal proceedings. I sat beside Thomas, whose presence was a quiet reassurance. The judge entered with a solemn nod, and the hearing began. Joanna's lawyer presented their case with practiced precision, laying out a narrative that I was declining, unable to manage my finances or make sound decisions. They had brought new medical evaluations, this time from a doctor none of us had met, who described early signs of cognitive impairment and increasing forgetfulness. The words felt like punches, not just to my dignity, but to the very essence of my identity. I sat still, listening, every sentence chipping away at the truth I knew to be my own. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly but firmly, recounting my daily routines, my visits to the doctor, the tests that showed I was well enough. I held up Dr. Clayton's report, and with Thomas's help, we questioned the credibility of their experts. The judge listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the stacks of papers we had submitted, the letters, the bank statements, the recorded phone calls where my voice was clear and coherent. But the courtroom was a battleground of narratives, and I was fighting not just for my freedom, but for my very name. The emotional toll was immense. Joanna looked almost angry, her usual warmth replaced by a cold determination. Victor rarely looked up, but when he did, his eyes held a mixture of pity and frustration. They believed they were doing what was best, even if it meant cutting me out. As the hearing dragged on, I could feel the fatigue setting in, the pressure mounting like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands pressing down on my shoulders. There were moments when I wanted to cry out, to scream that I was still here, still whole. But instead I kept my voice steady, my words deliberate. After hours of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal wrangling, the judge called a recess. I walked outside, the spring air sharp and bracing against my skin. I found a bench near the courthouse steps and sat down, trying to steady my breath. My mind raced with memories of Clara, how she would have held my hand, whispered encouragements, reminded me that I was stronger than I believed. But Clara was gone, and all I had now was the faint hope that truth and justice could prevail in a room full of strangers. During the break, a court clerk handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from a medical facility I had never heard of. It was an evaluation, allegedly conducted on me during a routine checkup, that I had no recollection of attending. The report painted a grim picture: significant cognitive decline, poor judgment, memory lapses. I stared at the pages, disbelief and fury twisting inside me. Someone was fabricating evidence. Someone was trying to silence me. When the hearing resumed, I confronted Joanna's lawyer with the letter. He frowned, flipping through the pages but offering no explanation. Thomas demanded to know the origins of the report, who authorized it, whether I had given consent. There was silence, evasive glances, and a subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere. The judge paused, making notes, her expression unreadable. That evening, exhausted and overwhelmed, I returned home. The house seemed darker somehow, shadows lengthening in every corner, memories whispering louder than usual. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter clutched in my hand, and realized that this was more than a legal battle. It was a war for my very existence, fought with lies, half-truths, and the cruel assumption that age equaled incapacity. But I was not defeated. I was not broken. I made a decision then, to uncover the truth behind the forged report, to expose the conspiracy against me. I began reaching out to medical professionals, requesting my records, demanding transparency. I contacted an investigative journalist I had met years ago, hoping she might take interest in a story where a father was betrayed by his own children. I hired a private investigator to look into the mysterious doctor and the facility that produced the false evaluation. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this was a coordinated effort, a carefully crafted campaign to erase me from my own life. But with each step forward, the isolation deepened. Friends who once stopped by became scarce. Neighbors who greeted me with a smile now averted their eyes. It was as if the shadow of the guardianship petition had spread beyond the courtroom, touching every corner of my world. Yet, amid the darkness, I found a spark of resilience. I was reminded of the history lessons I once taught, the stories of resilience, of those who faced insurmountable odds and refused to bow. I was one of them now. As the final hearing loomed, I prepared myself not only with legal documents, but with a renewed sense of purpose. I was determined to reclaim my dignity, to prove that age and illness do not define a person's worth. I would speak my truth loud and clear, and if it meant standing alone, so be it. Because in the end, what mattered most was not the outcome of the court, but the preservation of my own soul. The days that followed the initial hearing blurred together in a haze of quiet dread and relentless resolve, the kind of mental state that settles into the bones of a man who knows that the people closest to him have become the architects of his ruin. I woke each morning not with the clarity of rest, but with a burning sense of unfinished battle, a heaviness in my limbs that had nothing to do with age or illness, and everything to do with betrayal that had found its way into the deepest chambers of my heart. I had spent my life trusting my instincts, cultivating wisdom through years of teaching, of raising a family, of loving Clara with the steadfastness of a man who never once believed he would be standing alone at the end of all things. And yet here I was, navigating a world where my own children, flesh of my flesh, were laying bricks into a coffin they were preparing to nail shut before I had even drawn my final breath. The private investigator I had hired, a wiry former detective named Hal Kepler, called me 3 days after the hearing with his initial findings. His voice was rough but precise, and when he spoke, I could feel the gears turning on the other end of the line. "Edgar," he said, "there's something rotten in that evaluation they submitted. The facility, this so-called Hawthorne Neurology Center, doesn't exist at the address listed on the documents. The doctor who signed the report hasn't held a medical license in this state for over 8 years. He lost it after a malpractice lawsuit." I stood frozen in the middle of my hallway. The phone pressed to my ear, Hal's words ricocheting through my brain like steel pellets. "You're telling me they used a forged report?" I asked, though the answer was already curling in my gut. "I'm telling you," Hal replied, "that someone either fabricated the whole thing or got that guy to sign off on it to lend it a false air of legitimacy. Either way, it stinks." I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with the sudden rush of clarity that so often follows despair. They hadn't simply misunderstood me, hadn't just erred on the side of caution or acted out of misguided love. No. Joanna and Victor had crossed into calculated manipulation. They had decided, for reasons still not fully known to me, that I no longer deserved the right to govern my own life. They had gone beyond legal maneuvering and entered the realm of premeditated deceit. And yet, they still came, still called occasionally, still left voicemails laced with syrupy concern, still asked if I needed anything, all while behind the scenes, they sharpened their knives and measured my coffin. I forwarded Hal's report to Thomas, who responded with rare, visible anger. "This is grounds for perjury, fraud, hell, criminal conspiracy if we dig deep enough," he said, slapping the table with his open palm. "If we present this at the next hearing, it'll tear their petition apart." But I didn't want to wait for the hearing. I wanted to confront the truth, to see it in their eyes, to give them one last chance to admit what they had done, not for forgiveness, but so I could know, definitively, that the children Clara and I had raised were lost to us forever. I invited them both to dinner. Joanna accepted almost immediately, suspiciously eager. Victor took longer to reply, eventually sending a curt message. "If it'll help clear the air, fine." I spent the afternoon preparing Clara's pot roast recipe, the one she used to make every Sunday. I cleaned the house thoroughly, not because I wanted to impress them, but because I needed to reclaim it as mine. I set the table for 3, polished the silverware, lit the old oil lamp that used to sit in Clara's reading nook. When they arrived, I could tell they were unsettled. Joanna's smile faltered when she saw the effort I had put in, as if unsure whether this was a genuine gesture or a trap. Victor was quieter than usual, his eyes scanning the room like a man walking into a room wired for explosives. We ate in silence for the first few minutes, the clinking of cutlery against porcelain filling the space between us like a language we had all forgotten how to speak. Finally, I spoke. "I know about the evaluation," I said. Joanna looked up sharply, her fork halfway to her mouth. Victor froze, then slowly set his knife down. "What are you talking about?" she asked, too quickly. "The Hawthorne Neurology Center," I said. "The doctor with the revoked license, the fake address." "I know you used a falsified report in court, Joanna." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I don't know what you think you know, but—" I cut her off. "Stop. Just stop. I'm not confused. I'm not losing my mind. I hired an investigator. I have the evidence. You tried to present forged medical documents to the court." Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then spoke, his voice low and resigned. "You weren't supposed to find out. We thought maybe if it just went through quickly, you wouldn't have to go through all this." "Go through what?" I asked, my voice rising now. "Go through the process of having my life stolen from me? Of being declared mentally incompetent while I can still recite Lincoln's second inaugural address from memory? Of watching my children scramble to claim my assets like vultures, picking clean a carcass that hasn't even stopped breathing?" Joanna's voice cracked. "It wasn't like that. We didn't know what else to do. You've been alone, and it's not safe, and you've fallen, and instead of talking to me like an adult, like your father, you decided to forge medical documents and petition the court behind my back." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "What did you hope would happen? That I'd just fade quietly into the background while you moved into my house, cashed my pension, and erased every trace of who I am?" Victor spoke again. "We weren't going to move in. We were going to sell the house." I laughed, bitter and humorless. "Of course you were." The conversation dissolved after that. Joanna tried to insist that it was all a misunderstanding, that they had acted out of love, but her words rang hollow, like a sermon preached from an empty pulpit. I watched them both closely, searching for even a flicker of remorse, of recognition that they had gone too far. But what I saw instead was something colder. Justification, entitlement, calculation. When they left, I knew something in me had irrevocably changed. I no longer saw them as misguided children. I saw them as adversaries. Over the following weeks, I prepared. Thomas helped me file a formal motion to dismiss the guardianship petition based on fraudulent evidence. We included Hal's report, the real doctor's letter, a notarized statement from the neurologist, and a transcript of my conversation with Joanna, which I had recorded legally under state law. At the same time, I went through every document in my home, reviewing the deed to the house, the details of my pension, the joint accounts. I began moving assets into protected trusts, notifying banks of unauthorized access attempts, changing beneficiaries, rewriting my will to reflect the truth. And then, just as I thought things couldn't sink any lower, I discovered they had attempted to access my life insurance. A phone call from the insurance company tipped me off. Victor had called, claiming to be updating contact information. When pressed, he said he was assisting his father, who was in a memory care facility. The representative, suspicious, had reached out to me directly to confirm. My hands shook as I held the phone, the depth of their deceit staggering in its boldness. By the time the second hearing arrived, I was ready, not just with documents and testimony, but with a steel spine forged in the fire of humiliation and betrayal. I walked into that courtroom with my head high, my back straight, and my truth sharpened like a blade. The judge listened carefully as we presented our evidence. When Thomas read aloud the details of the falsified evaluation, I saw Joanna's face pale. When the private investigator testified about the defunct facility and the doctor's revoked license, Victor's shoulders sagged. When I took the stand, I spoke plainly, not as a victim, but as a man who had fought his way back from the edge of erasure. When the judge ruled in my favor, declaring me fully competent and dismissing the petition, I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, thanked the court, and walked out into the afternoon light feeling a strange mix of grief and triumph. My children had tried to bury me before I was dead. They had underestimated the power of a man who still remembered who he was. And now, for the first time in months, the path ahead, though lonely, belonged to me again. In the weeks following the court's decision to deny Joanna and Victor's guardianship petition, I found myself drifting through the days with a peculiar mixture of grim satisfaction and deep, unsettling silence. The relief I should have felt was quickly replaced by a heavier realization. There was no going back from what had happened, no way to unsee what I had seen in my own children's eyes, no path back to the comforting illusions of family love and loyalty that I had held on to for far too long. The ruling had restored my legal autonomy, but the bonds that had once tethered me to a shared life with Joanna and Victor had been severed cleanly, surgically, with the cold blade of betrayal. I was free now, yes, but in the same way a man is free when cast out of his home and told to survive the winter alone. I knew they wouldn't stop. Not because they had any legal ground left to stand on, but because they had tasted power, had come so close to achieving what they thought they were entitled to. And that kind of hunger doesn't vanish with a judge's ruling. And sure enough, it didn't take long before I began to feel the tremors of their next move. Not in the form of legal documents this time, but in more insidious ways. Anonymous complaints were filed with my homeowners association about noise, about my unkempt yard, about the supposed smell of gas leaking from my kitchen. I received letters from the local utility office requesting inspection access, even though I hadn't called for any maintenance. My mail began arriving opened, my trash bins mysteriously overturned. A quiet harassment campaign had begun. And though there was no return address, no signature, I knew exactly where it came from. Rather than respond with panic or retreat, I acted. I contacted Thomas and asked him to begin exploring options for liquidating my assets, starting with the house. If my children were determined to hound me out of the life I had built, then I would take away the one thing they still wanted, the inheritance they had been circling like vultures. The house Clara and I had paid off over decades, the property they no doubt viewed as their rightful prize, would be sold on my terms. I reached out to a real estate agent, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Valerie, and told her I wanted a quiet, fast listing. Within 2 weeks, the house was on the market, and within 3 I had a firm offer, more than I had expected. I signed the papers the same afternoon. That evening, I sat in the living room surrounded by boxes, photographs, and fading traces of a life that had once felt permanent. I picked up Clara's framed picture, held it close, and whispered that I was sorry. For the children we had raised, for the blindness we had shared, for the soft kind of hope that had kept me from seeing the rot taking hold beneath our family's surface. I wasn't running, not exactly. I was erasing the battlefield, removing the last place where they could try to corner me again. If they wanted to chase ghosts, they'd have to do it elsewhere. The real act of finality, however, came 2 days before the move. I went to the joint account Joanna had refused to relinquish even after the court decision and closed it. Every dollar I had put into it over the years, money she had quietly withdrawn, spent without acknowledgement or thanks, was now gone. The bank's clerk, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, asked me if I was sure. I said I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. I took the check, deposited it into my private account, and then, in a moment of spiteful clarity, contacted an attorney who specialized in estate restructuring. I rewrote my will. Every cent, every remaining asset, every book, every heirloom, every last thread of my life was rerouted away from my children. I donated half of it to Clara's old university, earmarked for scholarships for first-generation students. The rest I divided among charities, local institutions, and the local historical society where I used to volunteer. When the lawyer asked about Victor and Joanna, I simply said, "They are no longer my family. Please make a note of that." The words felt cold in my mouth but true. For once, painfully, unequivocally true. On moving day, I watched as the movers packed the last of my things, my world condensed into a few cardboard boxes and a single suitcase. My new apartment was modest but bright, tucked away in a quiet community where no one knew my name. No more family photos on the walls. No more antique grandfather clock echoing Clara's taste. Just clean white walls, warm sunlight, and the faint scent of new beginnings. I felt no triumph, no victory, only stillness. A quiet that wasn't empty, but earned. And then, the inevitable happened. Joanna appeared. I came back from the grocery store one afternoon to find her sitting on the stoop of my new building, dressed in a fitted blazer and dark sunglasses, her expression unreadable. She stood when she saw me, brushing imaginary dust from her lap, and said, "So this is where you've gone." I said nothing, just stepped past her and unlocked the door. "Dad," she said, following me, "we need to talk." Inside, she didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room like a solicitor. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking at the edges. "Why are you trying to punish us?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the child I had raised, but a woman shaped by years of quiet ambition and carefully measured affection. "This isn't punishment," I said. "This is protection. I'm protecting what's left of me, from you." Her mouth twitched as if she were about to cry, but no tears came. "We're your family," she said. "You don't turn your back on family." I laughed, softly. "You turned your back on me the day you decided I was more valuable as an invalid than as your father." She said she didn't understand, that she had only wanted to help, that everything had been misinterpreted. But I had heard these words before. I had lived the consequences of her kind of help. When I handed her a copy of my new will, her hands trembled. She read the opening lines in silence, then looked up at me with wide, stunned eyes. "You've disinherited us?" I nodded. "Not out of anger, out of necessity." Her voice rose. "This isn't fair. You're not thinking clearly." I held up a letter from Dr. Clayton, recently updated, affirming my mental clarity and decision-making ability. "I'm thinking more clearly now than I have in years." She stared at me for a long time, and then, slowly, something inside her hardened. The vulnerability drained from her face, replaced by the cold, calculating look I had come to know too well. "You'll regret this," she said, almost a whisper. "When you're alone. When no one visits. When no one remembers your birthday." I smiled. "I've already lived that. You just didn't notice." She left without another word. I watched her walk down the hallway, her heels echoing like distant drums. And I felt no satisfaction, no bitterness, only relief. The performance was over. The curtain had finally fallen. That night, I sat by the window, watching the lights shimmer on the lake beyond the trees. I thought of Clara, of the life we built, of the children we raised with all the love we had. I thought of every bedtime story, every lunch packed, every sacrifice made in the name of a family I now understood had never quite seen me as I saw them. And I said her name out loud, just once. Clara. Not out of grief, not out of longing, but as a benediction. I had done what I could. I had survived their plans, outlived their greed, and reclaimed my name. That would have to be enough. Some endings come with thunder, with slammed doors, and shouted words that echo through generations. But mine arrived with silence, thick, absolute, unmovable silence that stretched across days, weeks, months. No more calls from Joanna. No terse emails from Victor. No letters. No demands. No petitions. Just stillness. A kind of exile not imposed by law, but by the quiet cruelty of absence. I had not expected reconciliation, but the finality of their disappearance still left a taste in my mouth like ashes. I moved through my new apartment like a man learning to breathe underwater, cautious, deliberate, aware that one wrong thought might drown me in the weight of all that had been lost. And yet, beneath the sorrow, there was clarity. A life stripped of illusion is not a life without value. It is a life sharpened to its truth. I began to form new routines, not the desperate mimicry of purpose I had constructed after Clara's death, but quiet, honest rituals that suited the man I had become. Mornings began with coffee brewed strong and black, a walk around the small lake near the edge of the complex, nods exchanged with a few other residents whose names I never learned but whose faces grew familiar. I volunteered at the Historical Society again, helping digitize old documents, catalog donated photographs, piece together the fading edges of someone else's forgotten family. There was something fitting about it. Me, a man abandoned by his own blood, preserving the stories of strangers so that they wouldn't be erased as I had nearly been. There were moments of loneliness, of course, days when the quiet was too much, when the ache of betrayal pressed against my ribs with renewed force. On those days, I wrote. I filled notebooks with my thoughts, not as memoir or testimony, but as record, as evidence that I had lived, that I had endured, that even in the absence of familial validation, my existence held weight. I wrote about Clara, about our first meeting at the campus cafe, about the way she laughed when I mispronounced bougainvillea. I wrote about the smell of fresh inked history textbooks, about the joy of unlocking a student's curiosity, about the scent of our home in autumn when she baked apple pies every Saturday. I wrote about Joanna's first recital, Victor's science fair project, the long drives we took to visit her sister in Maine. I wrote about the erosion, the slow, almost imperceptible shift from connection to distance, from warmth to suspicion, from love to transaction, and in writing, I made peace not with them, but with myself. Occasionally, I would see headlines about elder exploitation, about families siphoning estates, about guardianship abuse, and I would feel a cold, familiar pulse of recognition. I did not become an activist, but I began to speak, quietly, in private, to people I met in line at the pharmacy, to a retired librarian who confided that her niece was helping with her finances, to a widower whose son wanted to move him somewhere more manageable. I didn't give advice. I told my story, and sometimes that was enough. One man even called me 3 weeks later to say he had reconsidered signing over his home. "You saved me," he said. I didn't tell him that I hadn't saved myself, not completely. I had only survived. Sometimes that's the same thing. One evening, 6 months after the final hearing, I received a letter in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Joanna, standing in front of what looked like a church, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy. There was no note, no explanation, just that image. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was meant as an offering, a taunt, or simply a trace of guilt left unspoken. I placed it in a drawer and never looked at it again. It didn't matter. The story had already ended. That photo was just an echo. The apartment aged with me. Seasons changed. I bought new furniture. I adopted a dog, an old mutt named Sam, who had been passed over at the shelter for years. We understood each other instantly. Two relics, still walking. He followed me from room to room, slept beside my armchair, barked at shadows as if daring the past to reappear. He was company, but more than that, he was loyalty without expectation. I told him everything, and he never judged me. In the end, I didn't die forgotten. I didn't vanish into the soft edges of dementia or surrender my life to the cold machinery of the courts. I endured. I reshaped. I reclaimed. When my time comes, and I know it's not far off, I won't be surrounded by family. But I will be surrounded by truth. The truth of who I was. The truth of what was done. The truth of how I fought back when they thought I wouldn't. When they said I was dying anyway. Maybe I was, but I outlived their greed. And I left something behind that was mine alone. The right to my own ending.